Okay, we can go ahead and get started and then people will join through. But hello, everyone, and welcome to the Race in the PR Classroom series. This is the student experience presented by the Institute for Public Relations and the PRSSA Educators Academy. I'm Tina McCorkindale. I'm the president and CEO of the Institute for Public Relations. So thank you all for joining us. So I'd like to welcome today's host, Haniya Sharif, the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at PRSSA. She's an intern at SISU Global and recent graduate from Temple University. We have Tamarra Thal, who's the Communications Assistant at the Diversity Action Alliance, incoming PR Specialist at IBM and a recent graduate from the University of Florida. And then we have Allie Brandon. She's a PR Digital Media Associate at Wundher and a student at the University of Memphis. And she's also on the planning committee of the PRSSA conference that's going virtual in October. So before we begin, so thank you all to the panelists for being here. We really appreciate it. And this is really great. I think the student experience is a very important perspective to have. And they're really great to be able to have this open forum and answer any questions that we have and sort of tell us about their own experience and what they can see that we can all do better. So before we begin, I'd like to remind you that this is a Q&A type forum. You can type a question in the chat box at the bottom of the screen or virtually raise your hand. If you virtually raise your hand, you can unmute when it's your turn and then ask the question. Other than that, we do ask that everyone please mute themselves. Once you're called on, please state your name and organization. If you would like to ask a question anonymously, please type the message to the host in the chat. That's either myself or Dean Mundy. And only the moderators will be able to see the question. You will remain anonymous. If you want us to say your name, then you can say, feel free to say my name. And Dean Mundy from the University of Oregon, wave Dean, will moderate the questions. If you're tweeting about the discussion, please use the hashtag RPRC. The discussion is being recorded and playback will be available on the website. And we will send an email with the playback information along with any resources that people add to the chat box or any resources that our wonderful panelists share. Lastly, please remain respectful to our host and others by keeping yourself muted at all times unless you intend to speak or ask a question. All right, so let's go ahead and get started, and let's get started with Haniya Sharif.
Hi everyone. So my name is pronounced Haniya Sharif. Tia, you almost got it. If anyone who knows me and is watching this knows that I always say it's honey with an just to help everyone pronounce it. So like I said, or like Tina said, thank you for the introduction, by the way. I graduated from Temple University in May with a degree in PR. I was the first co-director of diversity and inclusion for my local Temple PRSSA chapter. And 1 year later, I became the second vice president of diversity and inclusion for PRSSA National, which is my current role. So as VP at PRSSA National, what I'm doing right now is I'm creating diversity and inclusion initiatives, educating our members, amplifying their voices, and having them share their unique stories, increasing representation. And right now, my main goal is to be the main pipeline for Black students and top PR agencies to gain awareness of each other so that they can connect. So I want to provide those amazing opportunities for our Black and Brown students. And then Tina, if you don't mind, can I add, we're offering each HBCU and HACU chapter, PRSSA chapter, one complimentary registration to our virtual international conference in October, which is called ICON 2020. And we would love for HBCU members and advisors to be present and included in the conference. So if you're interested, or if you know someone who's interested, please email me and I'll actually provide my email in the chat in a little bit. So Tina, did you want me to go into like the gaps I've seen?
Sure, yeah, that'd be great.
Awesome. So personally, some of the gaps I've seen are the kinds of conversations we have about D&I in the classroom. So for my PR diversity class, for example, we went over things like, what is diversity, what is equity, what is inclusion, social privilege, the idea of reverse racism, and the fact that exposing ourselves to the elements of a system that needs to be dismantled is in fact not an attack on anyone, which is pretty cool to think about. Of course, we also learned about Black history and colonialism, not too much, but it was a brief overview. And all the education was necessary. However, I feel like we didn't learn enough about Black or Brown pioneers or Black excellence when it comes to communications. We certainly heard a lot about Ivy Lee and Edward Bernays, but not Joseph Barney Baker or Inez Kaiser. And I'm sure Tamarra and Allison, you've been through the same thing. And, I feel like we should be talking about relevant issues like hair types in the workplace and how there are actual workplace laws in the US that forbid Black women from wearing their natural hair in the workplace. We should be hearing from our professors that, all hair types are professional. And I also believe that students still think that they don't really need to be part of the D&I discussion if there's someone else in the room with a D&I position or title like myself. So that leads them to thinking, or to not knowing how they can be a part of the discussion as a communicator. So I think it'd be a great idea to teach students about the actions they can take when they're in their internships or in the workplace after graduation, such as, things like holding regular staff discussions, sharing resources, inviting representatives from key organizations to speak, and communicating how a sense of belonging and D&I tie to your internship or your company values. So these are the kinds of things, like actionable steps we can take as communicators. It's something that we can all do and all make happen, even if we don't necessarily have a D&I title. And some of you have heard me talking about this before, but I will keep speaking on it. I believe that there is a systemic issue when it comes to paid versus unpaid internships, which is huge for students. I actually believe it's one of the reasons why the PR industry is struggling to become more diverse. So a lot of our college's PR and comms programs typically require an internship. And unfortunately, a lot of the internships are unpaid, but they're how you get experience. And while it's great to get that real world experience through an internship, experience itself doesn't help students pay for rent, groceries, or student loans. It's a privilege that the average young American college student, especially those who are Black, brown, disabled, living in high cost cities, can't afford. And the fact is, unpaid internships actually give an unfair advantage to PR students from a privileged background by allowing them to move ahead of those who do need to be paid in order to afford regular expenses, like I said, food, tuition, etc. And the result is this constant cycle that allows wealthier students to capitalize on opportunities that, once again, others can't simply afford. So I will say, wanting a paid internship doesn't mean students think that they should just have things handed to them, but rather they should feel like their work is worth something, meaning money, and that they're worth something. So it's important to remember that, when many PR students graduate, sorry, my mouth is getting dry. It's important to remember that, when PR students graduate from college, they're often trapped in these low salary positions because they may lack the experience that they were not privileged enough to gain. So that can explain why you typically might see white and or privileged people moving up in the PR industry and Black and brown people being the first ones to get laid off during a crisis, which we've seen, during COVID-19. And I learned that the PR Council, which is an association representing 110 PR firms, they set a great example in June 2019. So in 2019, they created this policy that requires their member firms to pay their interns at least minimum wage. So with the social unrest, the protests, the uproar on social media this summer, due to police brutality taking innocent Black lives, I know a lot of people have woken up. So I'm hopeful that more organizations will follow suit in terms of creating these D&I initiatives and opportunities for Black and brown students to land paid PR internships and connect them to jobs. So that was my spiel. Sorry if that was too long. Thanks, everyone.
That was great. So Tamarra, what about you?
Yeah, so thank you again, Tina, for the introduction. And, I'm really glad to be on this panel. Just a brief introduction on myself. As she said, my name is Tamarra Thal. I recently graduated from the University of Florida, Go Gators. I was a public relations major and a business administration minor. And so having been through all 4 years of college, it's honestly a pleasure to sort of reflect on my experience and sort of bring my perspective as a Black woman in the PR classroom. And so when I was invited to do this, one of the first things, the first thing that came to my mind was mid-March or early March, around that time when all of these civil and racial discourses started to truly unfold. And thinking about the feeling that a lot of me and my friends had to go through, it was a lot. And so I remember actually reaching out to some of my Black friends in my classrooms and stuff, and we all started to just reflect on everything, and the emotions that were felt, it was heavy and it was sad. And one thing that sort of dawned on me as a Black student was that, oftentimes other students, they get to sort of disassociate their identity from the classroom and their identity from education. But as Black students, we don't truly get that. You know, the next day we were expected to sort of perform at the same capacity as we were before, although that's hard, you know, when we have to mourn the deaths of two people that we didn't even know. That's tough. And, you know, getting in the classroom and, you know, just sort of, you know, thinking about some microaggressions that might have come about after this, or racial aggressions, you know, overt racism that might have come about after this. These are all things that we have to think about as Black students, and it's sad and it's unfair, but you know, having these discussions and these conversations moving forward, it's going to be super helpful. And I was sort of talking to Allie about this earlier, and I feel for the freshmen, the sophomores, and the juniors who have to be in the classroom right now after everything that's going on. Although with that being said, I am a bit hopeful actually for, you know, the PR industry and PR students in the classroom, because I've seen the conversations that have been going on, and I do think that more people are paying attention and, you know, paying attention, although I will say, and having these conversations isn't where we should stop. It's a good starting point, but making sure that we're doing actionable items to actually remedy these racist acts that are happening on campus and these microaggressions that are happening on campus. And, you know, this actually brings me to some of the gaps that I've seen in the classroom. And so I guess if I could identify one thing, I think one thing for me would be to have, for PR professors to have more of a holistic approach at discussing diversity and inclusion. And so from my experience in the classroom, and I say this very frankly, whenever race was brought up, it was only ever as a reaction to an event that would occur. And so, you know, we learned about Gucci and the blackface, but we didn't learn about how, you know, non-Black students or non-people of color could have prevented this holistically throughout, you know, our courses and stuff. So, you know, we don't only want to be reactions. We want to be proactively helping students of color, helping students of other diverse backgrounds. And then I guess another area that I see could be an area of improvement as well. And so this one has to do with accessibility. And Haniya, you touched on this perfectly as well, but just to sort of talk on my perspective on it. So me and my friends, I remember us talking about some panels and forums that we would listen in on in the classroom. And those on the panel were very homogenous. So not only racially, but, you know, socioeconomically as well. And so, you know, they would talk about, you know, in PR, you know, you have to have an internship, although if you can't get one, finding an unpaid one is fine. And to those of us in the crowd who, you know, were from a low-income background, it's not just fine to have an unpaid internship. Sometimes we can't just do that. We can't just move to New York on a whim in an unpaid internship because that's not accessible to us. And so I think, you know, when we sort of present opportunities to students, making sure that we're including all students, not just those who can afford to move to New York, afford to move to DC on an unpaid internship. And then finally, I think, you know, one of the biggest things I could have honed in on, you know, throughout my career, and something I hope more professors and other people in leadership positions bring about, it's mentorship and sponsorship. And just to sort of shout out one of my mentors, Pat Ford. I don't know if he's in on this call, but, you know, he's been one of the most hands down critical and pivotal people in my career who has made an impact. And, you know, people like him and organizations as well, such as the Sponsor for Educational Opportunity, that's a shout out to them as well. Those have been the organizations that literally sponsored me and helped me, you know, move to New York when my parents probably couldn't have afforded to do that for me. And so, you know, this is not to say that on my own merit I couldn't have made it, but oftentimes we don't have the opportunities. It's a lack of opportunity. It's a lack of access to these, you know, these internships. So yeah, I think if we could just, you know, do anything, it's making sure that we're offering these opportunities to students and that we're literally sponsoring them, and that we're making things more accessible to all types of students. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really great. Okay, Allie.
Yes. Okay. So hi, everyone. I'm Allie Brandon. I'm a senior at the University of Memphis, a PR student. So I serve as the chapter president for PRSSA, which kind of like diversity and inclusion has always been something that I've been very passionate about. And especially recently, I've reflected a lot on, I saw a tweet, I don't remember when I saw it, but it said something about like, can you recall the last time that you had a Black teacher or Black professor? And that was something that really resonated with me. And that's something that I've really tried to highlight in my actions as a PRSSA chapter president. And then also I'm serving on the planning committee for the international conference. So that's something that I'm really passionate about, is diversifying faculty and resources and things like that. So just to give a little perspective, so in my department, we have, I want to say there's either 2 or 3 Black professors. And that's something to me that I, like, as Black people, you notice when you're one of the only Black people in the room, or there's no Black professors or Black professionals or anything like that. And I think that a lot of the times, not necessarily my university, but a lot of people give the excuse of there's just no Black applicants, or there's just no candidates, or things like that. And I really want to get out of this idea of making excuses for why we just can't fill this quota. So I think some of the things that I've really been thinking about are ways that we can reach out to people, or even just like, I think in my college career, even like GAs in my classes, I've never even had a Black or brown GA in my class. And that's something that's directly people from your grad school. So I think that a lot of that is something that I really want to touch on and just talk about, because that's something that's super important. And I know that other students feel that way. And also as a leader in my department or my chapter, I really work to empower students to speak out on things, because I've always been an outspoken person. So I have no problem speaking out on these issues, because that's just my personality. But there's so many other students that don't feel empowered, whether that's because they think, oh, well, if I speak out on this, I'm not going to be able to get a recommendation letter from this person, because they're going to think that I'm trying to start something, especially as Black women. Like, there's always this narrative that you're just trying to start something. You're the person who's creating problem. Like, people need to feel empowered in your classroom, in your school, in your programs, to speak out on things and not feel like there's going to be repercussions for that. So that's something that I'm super passionate about, and really think needs to be changed throughout these years. And especially right now, as we see programs, putting out statements in relation to all of the things that have been going on recently with George Floyd and police brutality, and that have been going on for years, but now are coming to the surface and people are finally picking up on. I think that a lot of people are kind of in the situation where they don't want that is this is something that everyone needs to know about, especially as future PR professionals, communicators. We have to be able to tell the stories of everyone and tell the stories of them accurately. And you shouldn't have to have non-people of color, non-Black or brown people telling the stories of these people. And I think that really does start in the classroom, whenever you have students seeing their Black, brown faculty and seeing that, PR is a very whitewashed industry. Like, I can make it. I see this, whether that's in the professors or the guest speakers that your professors bring in the class. I think that there's a lot of work to be done. And as soon as we, start this open relationship with students feeling empowered and encouraged to talk to their professors about things that they're passionate about and that they see, we'll really start to see that change, and it'll trickle down into the future of PR.
That's great. Thank y'all. So we have about 25 minutes for questions. So if you wouldn't mind, if you have questions, to either type them in the chat or to raise your hand, and then I can monitor those. While you're thinking about that, though, I wanted to sort of piggyback on what Allie and Tamarra were talking about specifically. And this is probably a question that a lot of us have, but definitely one that I have. So we always think about in the classroom in terms of like, how can we, support D&I issues and really have this ongoing conversation. What are some things that professors can do outside of the classroom in terms of helping create community and helping support all people of color, all underrepresented communities in our schools. Because we tend to, as professors, sort of talk about, here's what we can do in terms of this lesson plan or in this classroom. But from what I've seen, from my experience, I would say 2/3 of education happens outside of the classroom, in those offices, talking to your professors during office hours, and meeting with professors and other students. Are there things that we can do to help support and build community outside of the classroom?
So I think one of the biggest things, in my opinion, is that in the past, and even right now, this has been something, talking about diversity and inclusion has been something that's always an option. You can put it in your curriculum, you can talk about it, it's up to you. So I think once professors start to switch their mindset of, this is not something that we're gonna just breeze through, or we're just not gonna talk about, there will start to be that conversation about, like, well, this is clearly something that we have to address, we have to talk about. And I think that will really help with, creating that. And I think also there's a lot of things that professors outside of the classroom, well, I know in COVID times, like, you can't really like get your students to go to something, but a lot of my professors, when it comes to like extra credit things, there's been extra credit opportunities to go to something, to go see a lecture or something like that. Like, build it in to where you have to go to something. I mean, I can't think of an example right now, but there's so many Zooms, there's so many books, there's so many things that you can do to educate yourself. And really, so I think once we start, stop looking at this as something that's optional and something that's mandatory to be an effective communicator, that whole mindset will change for students.
Yeah, Allie, I completely agree. The mindset is everything. And, professors really do need to start getting comfortable. And I know this is so cliche to say, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. We discussed this before, but, typically in a classroom, when like the idea or the topic of race comes up, typically it's reactionary. And also when it does come up, like, the professor will look at the one Black or brown student in the class and be like, hey, you got anything to say about this? You have any thoughts on this? And it's like, sometimes we shouldn't, Black and brown students shouldn't have to carry the conversation on their back. Or why do they have to contribute every single time? Sometimes they don't want to. So I think professors should start, again, educating themselves and learning how to bring up these issues and talk about it and teach their students, instead of letting the one Black or brown person in the class or student in class talk about those issues. And also, I think it's important to, talk about what's going on in the news. So of course my professors tell us, like, watch the news and everything, and keep up with like current trends. And I think they should bring that into the class and talk about, and bring in a race too, because I feel like it's just students who raise their hands and they're like, you know what, I actually have something to say about this, and the professor doesn't know how to respond when the topic is about race. After Tamarra, I might have to add something, because like I have a lot of thoughts about this one. Like, go ahead, Tamarra.
Yeah, I mean, both of your points were honestly excellent, but like, I guess one thing I would add as well. So one thing I've seen done, and I definitely appreciated it. So at my school, sometimes when professors would invite, people to speak in the classroom, they'd also invite specific students to, have lunch with that person, or, come to other events. And so I think sort of breaking this barrier of exclusivity, and, because sometimes Black or other marginalized students don't really have the access to speak to, top professionals in the field. So literally giving them the opportunity to have lunch with, the CCO of X company, that definitely helps, sort of break down this exclusivity. And it also helps with the culture of your school as well, because, especially in my experience, I've been in situations where I didn't feel welcomed. And so when you do bring me into the room and invite me into the room to talk to professionals, that makes a whole lot of a difference in how I perceive, accessibility in the school itself.
Oh, can I add one more thing?
Of course.
Okay, so I also believe, it's important for professors to be creating this safe space to help others understand what it means to be a Black person, a Black student, and a Black PR professional in this country. And we shouldn't be hearing this from Black professors. We need our white professors to step up and highlight these topics too, and not just focus solely on the negatives, like all the bad stuff, but also positive things like Black excellence and where trends came from. I mean, we need to be staying on top of our trends in like pop culture and even in PR. They come from Black culture. And I think our white professors, if they talk about this is really important. And that's the bottom line, it is important. But when they see their white professors do it, it's like, okay, you know what, I can talk about these things too. Thanks.
That's great. Thank y'all. So another aspect, and Tamarra, I'm gonna ask you to speak first about this, if you wouldn't mind, because you touched on this a bit. And could you talk about the importance, sort of drill down on the importance of sponsorship, mentorship programs, and how they should look, right? I mean, and what that kind of relationship should be in terms of helping train professionals, right? And to help really nourish that professional development, because it's so important, and we all talk about it. But a true mentorship is something that takes time to really nourish and to really develop, and it's more than just a term, right? More than just one semester of here, I'm going to help you find an internship. It's a longer term relationship. So would y'all mind talking about that a little bit?
Yes, and honestly, I could talk about this topic all day. I love mentorship and sponsorship. I'm pro all of that. But, when we think about, the difference between mentorship and sponsorship is sort of telling your students how to get where they need to go, and sponsorship is bringing them to that end point. And so, I think not one is better than the other. We sort of need both of those in order to help students thrive. But I guess, in my critical to my success, so giving some examples out there with the LeGrant Foundation. Some of you may have heard of it, but it basically helps students of color, gain access to these top companies, or learn from professionals. And so having this opportunity to sort of have conversations with people, learn about the PR industry, and then potentially have a job lined up with them, that's amazing. And a lot of us don't typically have that just lined up. And so having had the LeGrant Foundation, and I mentioned this one earlier as well, but sponsorship or educational opportunity, they were specifically a sponsorship organization that literally gave room for people of color to enter top companies. And this is actually how I heard of IBM, and got to experience that internship opportunity, and then now have a job lined up with them. I couldn't express more how important it is to make way for students of color and other marginalized communities in these spaces where typically we aren't invited, and typically we aren't sort of like given the necessary environment to thrive. And on the topic of thriving as well, and we sort of hear this in the conversation of affirmative action, I think it shouldn't just stop in where you make room for these marginalized students and people, but that you give them the environment itself is making way for them to thrive as well. Because if you just put them in a spot experience in it, they're probably not gonna succeed too much, or maybe they will, but we're making sure that we're not leaving those students behind. And so just making sure that once you make room for these students, that everyone is on board. Leadership is being held accountable for how they treat these people, and everyone, making sure that microaggressions aren't a thing in the environment, and that we aren't just going to want to leave. And if I could just be a little bit more frank as well, when I first got to UF, it was a bit of a culture shock for me. I started through one of our programs called AIM, in which they sort of bring underrepresented students to UF, and it was a huge culture shock. But I think AIM is what sort of helped me stay, because I was genuinely considering leaving just because I felt like I wasn't welcomed. There weren't that many Black students, to be honest, and just people weren't really catering to sort of the needs that would help me thrive in this environment. But AIM sort of like brought all of us together and made us realize, you know, here's what you can do to succeed. Here's some representation of people who have succeeded, who were in your shoes and are now thriving. And those are all the things in combination and culmination that helped me sort of push through all of the barriers that I once was facing. That's it. I'll pass it on to the next person.
Awesome. Does anybody else want to talk about sponsorship, mentorship?
Yeah, sure. So, Tamarra, that was awesome. I'm so glad you shared that with us. That's something I gotta look into myself. And, you know, from experience and from research, you know, I found that gender and race pairings in mentorship are the most successful. And, you know, regarding the classroom, if there's a female Black professor in front of the classroom, there's more likely of a chance for a young Black female student to reach out and connect with that professor and start that mentee-mentor relationship. And, you know, I was lucky enough, like in my senior class, my capstone class, it was being taught by an Indian professor who was a woman. And I was like, oh my God, finally, I've never seen an Indian professor ever. So I was really excited about that. And, you know, that helped spark that connection because of not only our race, but also the fact that my dad and she were born and raised in the same city in India, which was like very unexpected and rare. So that was awesome. And, you know, in PRSSA, my local chapter, my first mentor was Pakistani, so I'm half Pakistani, and that really helped. Like, I would say that was one of the biggest motivators for me to stay in PRSSA and, you know, be successful in the chapter. And then I also want to add, I know I keep, you know, sliding stuff in, PRSSA has actually launched or is creating their mentorship program, which is called Mentor Connect, and that's launching in early September. So if any professionals are interested in serving as a mentor, I can provide some information in the chat as to who to reach out to. So thank you.
Yeah, and I'll add a little bit onto what both of you guys said. Great points. I agree 100% with what you said, but to bring it a little bit more back to the classroom, I think I know I have a professor, Terry, I think she's in here. She is like always on it about promoting students can go to the PRSSA meetings for this cost. Like there's a discounted rate, trying to connect our students with, you know, professionals in that society. So I think there is the PRSSA program, like you mentioned, connecting people with mentors, but also just, you know, giving your students the resources, promoting things like the LeGrant Foundation, this mentorship, having speakers come in who students will possibly want to reach out to, or just, you know, really starting to bring those relationships at bay. And also like at University of Memphis, we're a pretty, I don't know the exact statistics, but we have a large Black student population, and even just connecting students with, I know as chapter president for PRSSA, I always connect people with NABJ in our department, or we have a huge NAACP chapter on campus. Like there's so many organizations that if you just almost sometimes reach outside of your bubble, there are so many connections that can bring you back to the PR industry, or just help you find a mentor that can really, you could really be open and honest about your experience with.
Allie, I have to say I really agree with that. It's all about expanding your network. And Tamarra, that brings me back to what your point when you said, you know, when we talked about creating spaces for Black students and professionals. I feel like right now with the social uproar, or, you know, social unrest and social media uproar, there was an immediate response to create more Black spaces. And I feel like that momentum has slowed down, but I'm glad we're still having these discussions, because I feel like these discussions are what's going to help build that momentum back up.
That's great. Thank y'all. If you wouldn't mind, like, I actually want to sort of shift focus a little bit just to get your insight. And this is something, this is definitely coming from my own experience at the University of Oregon, which is predominantly a white institution. And there are many, many challenges with that pedagogically. But a lot of times I have conversations with students in terms of and I don't even know how to really address this, but the misrepresentation of diversity on campuses when students are applying to campus in terms of promotional material, how the university is presented to them. And I've had so many students who, when they get on campus, they're like, wait a minute, this is not as diverse as I thought it was going to be based on everything that I saw when I was applying through the promotional materials. Could you speak is this just an Oregon thing? And I mean, I've seen this at a couple of well, one quick sort of anecdote was when I was in graduate school, one of my best friends was the only Black member of our cohort, and he came running into my office, and he was like, "Can I please hide here?" And I'm like, why do you want to hide? He was like, "Because they're doing a new promotional thing for the school, and they want me in every picture, and it's misrepresenting exactly who we are." And that was the first time that I had ever really had that perspective, and I've seen it throughout my career since then. So I don't know if you've experienced that, and what the balance is, because obviously it's an aspirational vision that schools want to have, but it's a lot of times misrepresenting what they do have. Any thoughts about that?
So I want to first talk on your anecdote about your friend. So I think that is something where my whole spiel about empowering students to like just be like, I am not going to be in your campaign because I'm the only Black student that you could find. I think that is huge when it comes to, I mean, obviously the university should never do that, but like it shouldn't be a thing where students feel like they need to do this to get their foot in the door or to get connections or to not risk something. So I think that's huge. And then as far as like so Memphis, I'm speaking a lot about PRSSA, but that's just what I'm like mostly involved in PR at my school. But our chapter is mostly Black students, and I don't know our department, but I have a lot of Black classmates. And I think that's something that like it's easy to be like, oh, well, like there's a lot of Black classmates, like, oh, well, we don't have that problem. Like we're always talking about diversity and inclusion. And that's something that's overlooked often too much, because you think like, oh, well, there's Black students, like they're clearly having these conversations. But I think there's always more that we can be doing as a, predominantly Black chapter or predominantly Black program or whatever it is, to really make sure that these messages are heard. And there's always things that you can talk about. Like I am transparent when it comes to that. I am a Black woman, but I'm a light-skinned woman. So I don't have the same experiences as my dark-skinned women classmates. Like there's always something that you can be educating your students about, no matter how good you think you're doing. And I think that a big thing that I've noticed is a lot of, which this is kind of, but I'm just going to say it anyways, is I think that a lot of people are getting praise right now for doing things that are the bare minimum. And we have to stop giving people, like when we hype people up and we're like, oh my gosh, like you're doing so good, they think, oh, okay, well, like that's good, I'm doing good enough. And that's not the case. Like there's always room for improvement, no matter what the race population at your institution looks like.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and great point. Allie, we shouldn't be hyping people up for doing what they're expected to do. That's something I firmly believe in as well. But to your point, Dean, your example that you brought up, I actually have experienced that as well firsthand. So I remember being at a cultural event. It was like a dance event for my school, and someone asked to take a picture of me, and they had a professional camera, so I just assumed it was part of the organization. And I think a few weeks later, I remember seeing myself, someone texted me, they're like, oh my gosh, you're on the UF pamphlet. And I was like, what? Because I hadn't been aware that they were going to just put me on a whole pamphlet, and sort of like show me off as representation. And so this topic is really interesting to me, because it's one thing to provide representation to students of color versus exploiting students of color. And so this is sort of like a sticky line, because where it becomes harmful is when, as you pointed out, Dean, when we sort of over-represent what's actually being done at the school. And so I sort of brought it up earlier, but I had a huge culture shock at UF, and some of the pamphlets I saw as well when I looking up the school, it made it seem as though it was a bit more diverse than it actually was. And, we could all be improving this, but, when students like me who come from, a predominantly Black neighborhood, and we come to a school where, it's not at all what we expected, this can negatively impact our mental health, our, physical health, a lot more things. And so, I don't think schools realize how harmful it actually is when they overrepresent what they have and what initiatives they're actually doing. So, to speak on that, I have experienced it, and I'm pretty sure a lot more students have experienced it as well. And there's a thin line between representation versus exploitation, but we need to, start talking about this and how we can prevent students of color from, coming into a situation where it's not at all what they expected.
That was awesome, you guys. And I think, I've had a slightly different experience. So, when applying to Temple and even being on the campus for the first time, I would admire the diversity that I saw. And, Temple University is like college diversity university, even though we're predominantly white. And I think there's a little bit of misrepresentation in terms of integration of students regarding race. So, on pamphlets and pictures, you'll see different communities of students, socializing and interacting. But at Temple, like when you're in the student center, for example, where everyone goes to eat and have lunch, you don't see those communities integrating. It's typically like, the Black groups over here, Asians over here, Latinos over here, white over here. Like, you don't see that integration. And for me, that was actually kind of a shock, because I was expecting to make friends who were, Indian and Pakistani like myself, and I didn't, because they were all in one bubble, which was the sorority frat Greek life group. And I was just like, I want to be friends with you, but I also don't want to be in Greek life. So it's interesting. And, I've been in this focus group that talked about diversity at Temple. And, when you first apply and hear about Temple, there's this group that, it's like the diversity and inclusion group that fuels D&I initiatives and everything. It's called IDEAL. And I was interested in, seeing what IDEAL does. But then when I'm actually in Temple, it's like, what do you do? I don't hear about IDEAL. I don't see what you actually accomplish. And I wish we could hear more from IDEAL and hear about what they're really doing for Temple. So, yeah.
That's great. Thank y'all. I appreciate your insight on that. And it's nice to know that Oregon is not the only school that faces these challenges. And looking in the chat, it looks like it's a pretty, it's a conversation that needs to be had. And looking at the chat there, I saw one question from Jen Little, and she was asking about what about financial challenges with attending or participating in PRSSA or PRSA for that matter, or other industry events. And I think that y'all touched on this a little bit earlier, but could you talk a little bit in terms of, are the access to be able to go to these events is not universal, right? And I always harp on, I love PRSA, but it's so expensive, right, to go to a lot of these different events. So could you talk about those different sort of, is that prohibitive, in terms of getting that access, being able to build that network?
Yeah, so I think in my experience, and Terry, who's in the chat, who is our faculty advisor, you have to put in the work to make sure that you're providing access and things like that as a chapter to your students of color and your Black students and everyone who might be marginalized in your community. So just an example of our chapter this semester is, so this past semester we raised a good bit of money, and if you need your dues covered, we'll pay them. We're gonna help you. And then we did last semester, there was a multicultural scholarship to get into PRSSA. And I think that there's things that you can do as chapter leaders and faculty advisors and things like that to really make sure that you're providing students with that. And I know for us, you don't have to be a dues paying member to attend anything that we do. So I'm not sure how other chapters are, but if you have a line of exclusivity within your chapter, that's just not necessary. Like, why do you have to make it to where you have to pay $55 to get in and get these resources? That's already limiting students from different opportunities. And I think right now, while there are so many negatives to this situation, right now everything's virtual, there are so many things that you can do to get your students engaged with PRSSA and just having talks with people who they might look up to or things like that, especially since it's just hopping on a Zoom call. I know our chapter is doing a coalition with other PRSSA chapters. So we're having events combining with those chapters, and they're all free. Like, you don't have to pay to come to these things. Or we're really working as a chapter, and Terry, our chapter advisor, does a really good job of making sure that money is not the reason for you to not be able to do that. And I know, so last October when we went to the international conference, we spent so much time looking for resources within our school, our communities, to figure out how can we get people to the international conference. It's in San Diego, it's expensive. The tickets were, they were expensive, and you have to fly and you have to pay for a hotel or things like that. So we all split an Airbnb to minimize costs. We figured out that the university does funding or things like that. We really worked to make sure that we were making the things that we're doing accessible to all students. So I think the biggest thing is to research and put in the work to make sure that you're really making your chapter as diverse and inclusive as you possibly can.
Yeah, and to that same topic, I think if quarantine and sort of COVID-19 unfortunately taught me, and probably a lot of us, anything, it's how easy it is to actually provide accessible things to a wide range of people. And so in the I don't know, like a few weeks that we've been in quarantine, I've been able to participate in so many free educational events, things that, pre-quarantine weren't just given. And I don't know, like, it feels like before, it's sort of like a slap in the face. Like, before, we knew what we could have done, and we had the opportunities to do these things and make them more accessible to people, but we just didn't. And now that we're forced to do it, that's when more people are given these opportunities. So, I see in the comments too, like, just this, to me, hones in back to the topic of sponsorship. So if we're not going to make them accessible to people, these universities and these departments should, as Allie put it, put your money where your mouth is and actually sponsor students and make sure that they're able to go out to these events. Because, I know personally a lot of my friends, and I as well, wanted to go to, a lot of PR international conferences, but, forking out $1,500, or I don't know how much money it was, but I know it's expensive, forking out that much money, it just isn't in our means, in our realm of possibilities for us. And it's unfortunate to just, see how many more people could have been able to, go into these opportunities and just get as much as they could out of it.
Tamarra, that's really interesting that you say that. And I actually hadn't thought about, the fact that COVID-19 has, allowed people to say, actually, you know what, you can do this for free. Like, that should have been happening before for our students. And I've heard so many Black and Brown students come up to me, or they've come up to me and say, like, hey, I can't afford to pay all this. Like, I feel like it's not, I'm paying all this money, but I'm not getting enough out of PRSSA. And I think, as Allie mentioned, like, as a chapter, we should be working together to, one, help students afford to pay the dues, and also find different benefits for our members, to help them understand that it is worth paying for these events and everything. So I know my local Temple PRSSA chapter, they've offered opportunities to help minority students and just students who couldn't afford to pay the dues, who needed help. They helped those students, luckily. But the financial issues do also stem from national, which is like why there's positions like, for me to talk to headquarters and say, hey, this is what's going on. We need our students to be able to attend these events, and they can't because they can't afford it. So it's about kind of being loud and speaking out for your local students and saying, hey, like, they need help and you guys have to help them. And And it's why our positions are so important. And this is why we're offering like complimentary registrations, scholarships, sponsorships, and offering advice for local PRSSA chapters to say, hey, reach out to your local PRSSA chapter and see if they can help you financially, or, offer sponsorships from them as well. So like I said, it's about being loud and outspoken, and expanding your network and seeing who can you talk to help you out. But I agree, it is a huge issue with PRSSA.
That's great. Thank you all for that too. I agree. I mean, one of my big things is access, right? Like we can't, why put up barriers where there don't need to be barriers to access with all of that. And one of my big things that this is a longer conversation, is I think it would be such a shame if academia returned to the way, like to doing things the way it was before COVID happened. I think we have a real opportunity to reshape how things happen, right? Because we've realized we don't need to actually spend $2,000 to have that experience. We can work around these things. So I think that while we're in the middle of, pardon my language, a complete shit show right now in terms of the pandemic, we have this opportunity to really come out of it in a different way, right? And one of those, I liked Terry's. Hi Terry, how are you? I miss Terry. But I like Terry's comment in the side of like, let's ask these major agencies to sponsor, right? To step up their commitment to really helping these experiences and to help sponsor. Great. Does anybody have, let me look just to make sure before I hand it over to Tina. Any more questions? Oh, and there's Terry. Hi, Dean. Okay. So Tina, I will turn it over to you. Thank you all. That was wonderful.
Sure. So as we wrap this up, maybe we can get some final words from each of you, parting words before we leave. So we'll start. How about Allie?
Yes, well, thank you so much for allowing me to speak on this panel and for listening to me. I think the biggest takeaway that I hope everyone to take away from this conversation is to just be more transparent with yourself and your students and your community, to really have these conversations, because now more than ever, they're so important. And I think to stop making excuses for yourself and your department is a big thing when it comes to, creating actual change that's necessary for our industry and academia.
Thank you, Allie. Okay, next, Tamarra.
Yeah, thank you for having us on this panel. This has been a great conversation. If I could just hone in on anything, as I've actually already specified, which is, providing mentorship and sponsorship to students of color and making sure that not only do we have access to these opportunities, but that we're able to thrive in them. And this goes out to the institutions and the companies, making sure that it's an anti-racist environment, not just a not tolerating racism. We have to make sure that we're actually making this an environment in which people can thrive and people can be their authentic selves. And then finally as well, one thing I wanted to just end on as well is that, at my school, me and some friends, we helped launch the first Black Public Relations Student Society. And, some people actually took offense to this, thinking that, we were separating ourselves, or we were doing, making this sort of racial divide worse. And I just want to emphasize the fact that, having these safe spaces isn't separation, it's having a safe space. We need these environments to sort of be ourselves when in general we don't have that. So, when you see students making a space for themselves to just talk freely amongst each other, instead of realizing that, or instead of thinking that, something that's against you or against your a group of people, to realize that it's more so pro us and pro helping us feel ourselves and feel safe.
Great, thank you. Haniya?
Mar, I'm so glad you mentioned that. Temple also has a Black Public Relations Society, and I think they're so necessary for our students to have that safe space and, feel like they can be their most authentic self. And thank you everyone for listening and being here today. Allie and Tamarra, I learned so much from you both, and I hope we can connect even more after this. And I guess lastly, all I have to say is, keep staying accountable, expand your network so you can create those spaces and help uplift others. be outspoken and get your money's worth, and let me know how I can help you and your chapters and your students, because that's what I'm here for. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Haniya, Tamarra, and Allie. We really appreciate you three being here today. So thank you all for joining us for this 5th session of the Race in the PR Classroom series. Thanks to my co-host, Dean Mundy, and to Nikki Caceres and our team, who always puts this together and does a fantastic job. Our next one will be on September 17th at noon Eastern Time. If anyone would like to participate in these sessions, or if you have any recommended panelists, please let Dr. Mundy or I know. Everyone enjoy your Thursday and have a fantastic